Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Zamanullah Sand. I facilitate digital programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. For this webinar, International Mother Language Day webinar series, we aim to celebrate linguistic diversity and multilingualism. We intend to promote awareness of equity and inclusion in education through discussions about linguistic human rights, importance of mother tongues, language sensitization, and other concerns about language. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Maya Temlani David for this webinar. Honorary Professor, Asia Europe Institute, University of Malaya, Professor Dr. Maya Kamlani David is also an associate member of the International Institute of Public Policy and Management, University of Malaya. She is an honorary fellow and member of Chartered Institute of Linguistics, UK, and is an exco member of an international NGO, Foundation of Endangered Languages. Dr. Maya Kamlani David is a former member of the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, FPL, University of Malaya, and was deputy head of postgraduate affairs in FPL before serving as the head of section co-curricular, University of Malaya from 2006 to 2013. Her intellectual interests center on language planning, language choices, maintenance and shift, and discourse analysis. She is the author of numerous books, and her publications include work in the field of sociolinguistics and sociocultural issues and applied linguistics. Her publications have been frequently cited in global researches. It's a pleasure having you at Teacher Development Webinars. Dr. Maya, welcome to Teacher Development Webinars.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanullah.
Yes. So, Dr. Maya, I'll be sharing your presentation and let me confirm if you see it.
Okay.
So do you see? Yes.
Yes, you're right. So the major theme of today's talk. Good evening, everybody. I'm from Malaysia and it's 6 o'clock in the evening in Malaysia. 3 o'clock in Pakistan, I understand. So the main question we need to ask ourselves in a global area where a lot of communities are losing their mother tongues or heritage language, practically daily, it has been reported that one language is being lost or dying. So we need to find out why are languages dying? What causes them to die? And in order to determine appropriate strategies to revitalize a dying language, I think it's very important to first understand why these ethnic communities have left their mother tongue, have shifted away from their mother tongue. And there are many, many reasons for language shift. And if you read the literature on language shift, it gives you many reasons by different communities for shifting the language. And as a researcher interested in revitalization of languages, I think it's important for us to understand what made them leave their language. What was the factor, the variable that caused them to lose their language and adopt a host community's language or the majority community's language. There are many reasons, and I will discuss some of these. These reasons range from political reasons to economic reasons to cultural reasons, educational reasons, social reasons like marriage, for example, and sometimes even brutal and very violent actions by majority governments towards minority communities. And this can cause language shift also. So the comparative, more powerful position of the host community's language also makes many minority speech communities shift to the language used by the majority community. So it is the more powerful language used by the host community if you are living in a different area. So I will now, in this presentation, provide you examples from different countries of what caused language shift. Can we move to the next slide, please? So first of all, we need to understand what we mean by language maintenance and language shift. According to Batibo, language maintenance refers to a situation in which a which a community manages to maintain its vitality can mean language maintenance. So Baker says that if you use your language, it's the language of dominant use in your home, in the marketplace, in the school, that is language maintenance. So in some communities, you have language maintenance in a number of important domains. The most important domain being the home domain. And in fact, Fishman, many years ago, Joshua Fishman said that if the language is lost in the home domain, then the community has actually shifted away from its language. So we have definitions for maintenance and shift. Shift simply means a trend that involves a speech community moving away from the habitual use of its heritage language to a local language or a language of wider communication. So it could be a local language, or it could be a more powerful language, like English is becoming a dominant language in Singapore, for instance. Although Singapore has many speech communities, like the Chinese speech community, the Indian speech community, the Malay speech community. But recently it has been reported that the dominant language is actually the world language, the language of wider communication, English. All right, so let's move on. So we need to know why communities shift away from the habitual use of the ethnic language. The focus is on the word habitual. What is their dominant language? What is the language they use automatically, habitually? Before we can even think of ways of revitalizing or making the language come alive, we need to know what causes the shift. Basically, there are two major movers of language shift, although I did say there are many reasons, but there are two major movers. One is the speech community itself moves away from use of its mother tongue because they see many benefits for so doing. These benefits can be educational, or economic, like getting a better job if you know another language and are comfortable in the other language. Social, because you want to assimilate with other ethnic groups whose language you now speak. And even political, because if the government through the education policy introduces another language which is not your mother tongue, then over time, because you go to that schooling system with another language, over time, the school language may also become the home language. So the community has no choice in this situation but to shift to the dominant language. They are forced to do so by political forces, by economic forces, and so on. Now, why did the community shift? Let me provide you examples from Malaysia, my own home country. Many countries all over the world which had been colonized, when they gained independence, they wanted their own national language to become the medium of instruction in school. So although countries like Malaysia, countries like Pakistan, countries like India had many ethnic communities, with independence, they had to make a decision that they wanted to choose a national language to become the unifying force that would bring the various multilingual people together. So in Malaysia, for example, the government with independence in 1957, and over time, the government decided that with independence from the British government, the medium of instruction in schools, in government schools, not the private schools, but in government schools, should move from English to the national language. So this was a top-down policy. And over time, many speech communities in Malaysia reacted to such a policy. So sometimes the reaction was acceptance in general cases because government schools were cheaper, much, much cheaper than private schools. The reaction was no choice but to accept going to government schools where Malay was now the national language and the medium of instruction. And over time, people of different ethnic groups in Malaysia have become very comfortable in the Malay language and use it both in the government workforce if they are civil servants and even with friends of different ethnic groups. So there has been shift over time due to the government language policy, the educational policy. But those who could afford it then sent their children to private schools where English was the medium of instruction. So you have within the country communities that shifted to English as the medium of instruction and communities that moved to Malay as the medium of instruction. So that is a top-down policy in Malaysia and in many countries. In Pakistan, I understand Urdu is deemed to be the language most often used and is the lingua franca. So in Malaysia, in Singapore, English also became the medium of instruction. What about the community response? So let me give you the response to a government policy. It depends on the communities, okay? So as I said, those who could afford it sent their children to private schools in Malaysia where English was the medium of instruction. But those who could not had to send their children to government schools. Now, when I was interviewing some Sindhi families in Malaysia, and the Sindhi community in Malaysia is very small, about 1,000, a little bit more than 1,000 in a population of nearly 33 to 34 million people in the country. So they're very minute, very small minority. And so the Sindhi parents that I interviewed some years ago informed me that both Malay and English were important, and that for a minority community, the mother tongue Sindhi had no utility. So here they were looking at their own language, their heritage language, their mother tongue, as a language which had no utility. And utility here meaning it would not bring them any benefits. Malay, the national language, would bring them benefits. English, the dominant language in the business circles in the country, would help them if their children moved to professional jobs. So communities basically need to see that the language that they are using or want to use have language utility. Yes, can we move on to the next slide? Yes, the next one. The next one after this, please. I want to move, this is Malaysia. I want to move on to Singapore. Yes, the next one, which says top-down policy in Singapore. Yes, thank you. Now, I recently reviewed a book by Ritu Jain, a Singaporean sociolinguist, and she edited the book where we had a whole number of writers, I think 14 writers talking about language policies in Singapore. And each community has reacted differently. So let me talk to you about the Chinese community in Singapore. The Chinese community is the most dominant and largest community in Singapore. But the Chinese community have many languages. Some call them dialects, others call them languages. There's Hokkien, there's Hakka, there's Teochew, there's Cantonese, and so on. But the prime minister, the longest living prime minister of Singapore at that time, Lee Kuan Yew actually made a ruling that Mandarin should be used by the speech community. And Mandarin is now used as the language in the classroom as a subject, not the dialects or the other Chinese languages. So Chinese community, apart from being taught in English as the medium of instruction, they have to also learn Mandarin, so as a subject. So what happened over time, many young Chinese children can today no longer communicate with their grandparents because the grandparents spoke the dialect, not Mandarin. So there was a language shift by the grandchildren because their schools, they learned Mandarin as a subject. And this I'm talking about the Chinese community. Now, what about Indian community? One of the fairly big Indian communities in Singapore is the Malayali community who speak Malayalam. And Anita Devi Pillai with Rani Rupdi discussed the status of Malayalam in Singapore. And they gave us different years what happened to the community's language. In the first phase, there was language maintenance due to the efforts of the first generation migrants. That's about 1900 to 1960. In the second phase, 1970s to 1980s, language shift occurred because many of the second and third generation Malayalis, due to the diminishing population with many returning to Kerala in India, and due to the government's urbanization programs, this resulted in a dispersal of the Malayali community from their own enclaves within Singapore to different parts of Singapore. So they were not like living next to each other anymore. They were spread across different parts of Singapore, and many of them also returned to India. So in the first generation, they maintained. Second generation, there was a slow diminishing use of the Malayali language because many returned to India and many who stayed behind in Singapore were no longer found in one center or one part of Singapore due to the Singapore government's urbanization program. So what then happened to the more recently, it's very interesting. What happened more recently is that in the 1990s to more recently to 2019, there has been language revitalization for the Malayali language. Because we have new migrants from India, the Singapore government opened their policy for other countries and other communities from other countries to come and do business in Singapore. So a lot of Malayalis from India migrated to Singapore, and they helped in the language revitalization of the Singapore Malayali community. So we see now that a new influx of migrants due to a change in Singapore's immigration policy resulted in bottom-up community initiatives led by the new migrants, and they helped to revitalize the Malayalam language. That was interesting because the government also, due to voices from the community, not only the Malayali community, but other communities, where before they said Indian communities only have to learn Tamil as a subject. More recently, the government policy has changed. Yes, English is the medium of instruction in all Singapore schools, but you have to learn a subject, and that subject has to be your own mother tongue. And for the Chinese, it was Mandarin. For the Indians, it was Tamil. But more recently, due to community pressure and community demand, and so you see here the bottom-up action by the community itself, the community efforts resulted in not only Tamil being a subject, because previously only Tamil could be a subject for all Indians, whether whatever your mother tongue as an Indian was. And you know, Indians have many, many mother tongues. You have Hindi, you have the Bengali, you have Punjabi, you have Sindhi, and so on. But what happened, the Singapore government then decided that for Indians, they could make a choice between a number of Indian languages, which included Malayalam and which included Hindi, because a lot of expatriates from India were now coming to Singapore. So you see now, with the Singapore government policy of permitting foreigners to come into the country, to live, to work and live in the country, what happened then, there was pressure from the community together with the older Malayalis who lived in the community, who lived in Singapore, to pressurize the government so that now, as an Indian in Singapore, there are a variety of languages you can choose from, not only Tamil, but you can choose Malayalam, you can choose Hindi, you can choose Punjabi. So a number of Indian languages were opened up to the Indian students. I now move on. I'm just giving you an idea of how communities can move away from their language because of top-down policies or bottom-up policies. So I've given you some examples from Malaysia and from Singapore. And before I move to Australia, in Malaysia also, coming from Malaysia, I have done a lot of research in Malaysia. Let me give you an example of people from Pakistan who overland many, many years ago, early 1900s, overland, they came overland, they didn't take planes or ships, they came overland and came into a part of Malaya, which is the east coast of Peninsular Malaya. And these were generally men, not women, and they settled down in one part of Peninsular Malaya, known as the east coast of Malaysia. So they settled down in the region of Kelantan. And I did a research on them and found that these men, Pakistani men, had married local Malay women. They had a common religion, Islam. So marriage was easy, and they had settled down and lived in the country. They could have gone back to Pakistan for a holiday, but Malaysia became their home, and their children grew up in Malaysia. Now, what happened to the Urdu language or whatever Pakistani languages they spoke when they first came to Malaysia in the early 1900s? Over time, with marriage and with children, what happened was the dominant language of the home domain in these mixed marriage homes then became the Malay variety, the Kelantanese variety of Malay. Malay has also got many varieties, so it became the Kelantan variety of Malay that became the dominant home language. And I was teaching a group of students in Kelantan, and they were all very aware that grandfathers or great-grandfathers, they were very aware of their Pakistani heritage, but they considered themselves as Kelantanese, and they spoke the Kelantanese dialect. So over time, across generations, they had lost the language of their grandfathers or great-grandfathers. And this happens also because of marriage. All right. Now, let me go on to another country, Australia. Let me move on to Australia. Australia, as you know, previous slide. Previous slide, please. Australia, as you know, had a top-down government policy where the Aboriginal languages were concerned. And these Aboriginal communities were treated very badly by the Australian white government. Children were separated from their families, and these children were taken away from their families. And these children are known as the stolen children because they were brought up and thought English. And in schools, they could only speak English, and they were punished and kicked out of the classroom if they spoke other languages. So you see, this is a top-down government policy where they felt that the Aboriginal communities who had been long in Australia, long before the white government was there, so they killed their languages by taking the children away. But today there's a lot of revitalization by certain Aboriginal communities and by sociolinguists and linguists who want to reactivate the language and encourage the community to use the language. So there has been language revival because of interest by social activists and by sociolinguists. And some of the people themselves, I have a professor friend who is an Aboriginal, comes from the Aboriginal community, who speaks very good English. She is an English language professor, but she also knows her mother tongue because there's an interest, and she's helping the community to help them to revitalize their languages. All right, so this is a top-down policy which has resulted in language lost. Now let's look at Hawaii. Next slide, please. I'm taking you in different parts of the world to show you what happens in different countries. There are different reasons for language shift, okay? In Hawaii, what has happened was because of colonialism, English became the language of the community, and they lost the Hawaiian language. And in the 1970s, only 50 people, according to a study, spoke the Hawaiian language. But today, the community is very proud of having Hawaiian as their mother tongue. And today, in schools, 5,000 children speak the Hawaiian language. So let me give you an example from Kashmir. And here I want to give you an example of a community, of members of a community from an original homeland who moved to another place. So we have this study by Abbasi and his friends. Abbasi is a Pakistani PhD scholar. He shows that young transplanted Kashmiris in Karachi use the Urdu language in different domains like home, market, education. Why? Because they see it as upward social mobility. So they see the language as having utility in the sense of helping them move upwards in the community. And here we are talking about a community that has moved away from its own country. It's moved to the city of Karachi, and they are more comfortable in using Urdu, which is the dominant language and the lingua franca, and they use it in different domains, including education, market, and most importantly, even in the homes. Now, this study was a very small study, so we cannot generalize too much from it. But if there are trends like this with a larger population, and we have similar studies done by other researchers, then we can see if the trend towards Urdu is happening and occurring among what we call transplanted Kashmiris, transplanted, moving away from their original homeland to a city which gives them a job. All right. Okay, let's move on. Now, this is the interesting part of my own study, which I thought was very important in language shift. It is the attitude of the community. The attitude of a community towards its mother tongue or its language. Previously, many studies show top-down policies, what has happened as a result of top-down policy, like government policy, like education, and so on. But here, I want to focus on attitude of the community itself towards its own mother tongue. So the concept of attitude plays an important role in the field of social linguistics. And attitude is defined as, and I quote, as a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entirety with some degree of favor or disfavor. So if you look at your own language with disfavor, you will move away from it. If you look at English with favor, you will move towards it. So the attitude of a speech community to its own mother tongue, if it's negative, can result in language shift. So if the community feels my language is not helping me get a job, they might move away and learn the more dominant language, which helps them get a job. So here the concept of utility, they see other languages having utility and giving them what we call social capital, giving them what we call upward social mobility. Upward social mobility here simply means they can move economically and socially upwards in the community. So let me provide you examples from my own work with the diasporic Sindhi Hindu community. And the Sindhi Hindu community, as you know, the majority of them left Sindh as a result of the partitioning of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. And let's look at this community which has no homeland of its own, not even in India, where many of them have moved to, but they have also moved to many other countries. And the Sindhi Hindu community is known to be found in most places in the world. So let's look at the attitude of the Sindhi language to the Sindhi language and reasons for shift by the community. Now, I was very fortunate that the views of the community were presented in an edited book by Sas Agrawal, an Indian, I won't call her a linguist, but she documents lives of people. So she talked to Sindhis coming from different parts of the world, having different positions and different professions, living in different parts of the world. And she actually recorded them, and their voices are heard in a book called The Sindhi Tapestry. I'm actually on the next slide. The book, it's an anthology edited by Sas Agrawal. See the third line there. And as I said, she interviewed a lot of people, and some of them actually recorded their feelings about the language. And these people were from different backgrounds, different countries, different socio-economic status. And their memoirs are recorded in this book, thick volume, 430-page volume. And I went through all their stories in this book, and I was able to analyze the reasons they gave to move away from their mother tongue. Now, what they said makes a lot of sense if we had interviewed their parents, but many of their parents are no more. Okay, so but they are talking about the life of their parents and of themselves as young refugees in India, and and they said as refugees in India, what was happening, they were seen as refugees. They had to leave everything behind and go to India as refugees. And although they had a lot of money and property whilst in Sindh, when they came to India, they came as refugees, and they were looked down. They were looked down by the larger Indian community. So their parents had no choice but to hide their Sindhi identity by not using Sindhi in the home. So these children growing up never knew of themselves as being Sindhi or having a Sindhi language, because the parents wanted to assimilate within the larger Indian community and not being looked at as refugees. So they hid their identity. And many of these children who are now adults actually said their identity was hidden. It was only much later as young men and young women that they found out that ethnically, as a community, they were Sindhis. But by then, they didn't know their language because their parents never used the language. So they give you examples in this book that as refugees in India, many of the young were taunted by their schoolmates and felt a need to diffuse this by not disclosing their ethnic identity. So let's move on. This generation two, the young children of these refugees, those who could afford it, who had relatives who could give them some money, they went to, those who couldn't afford it, they went to government schools where local Indian languages were used. But those who went to boarding schools, English was used. So one of the respondents in this book actually says, English became our language of communication and choice in these schools where English was the medium of instruction. A third reaction by some members who reported and who were living in Spain and in Europe, they said, we have become global citizens. So we move from country to country to make a living. They report quite proudly that they can't read or write Sindhi, but is it a problem? No, they say, it's not a problem. And I quote, I am living the life of a global entrepreneur, hospitable and family-oriented Sindhi. So by then, they did not see the language as being important to their identity. But what they saw was the fact that they were entrepreneur class. They were doing very well now, the third generation. They were helping people, they were helping members of their community, and they were very family oriented. So they looked at value systems of the Sindhi community as showing their identity rather than language, right? They didn't feel a need. Although now, and this is another paper, I could talk to you about the various revitalization programs to help the community go back to its own language. That's another paper altogether, and it has been published in a book by Routledge, which is online open access, so you can have a look at it about the community and the revitalization programs for this community. All right, now let's move on to Sindh itself. As a Sindhi, I would like to give you some examples of migration within the country. Just now, I gave you an example of the Sindhi Hindu community, who are a community in diaspora found in different parts of the world. But let's look at Sindh itself, and Sindh in Pakistan has many communities. So when I talked about earlier about migration to other countries, what about migration within a country? Does it result in shift? And I did a study with a Pakistani MPhil student, and Amir Ali and myself, we did a study of the Baluchi and Brahwi community in Sindh. And our findings, and these are communities who have moved away from their own homelands in Balochistan. So our findings that these people in Sindh, the Baluchi community in Sindh has assimilated to this dominant language, which is the Sindhi language, both in the work and home domains. But in contrast, the Brahwi community, which has migrated also in Sindh, they have shifted to the Sindhi language in the work domain, but they have not shifted in the home domain. So they still maintain their own Brahwi language in the home domain. And so we see two communities coming from a different part of Pakistan, the Balochistan region, they have moved to Sindh, and in Sindh, one community has moved to Sindhi, even in the home domain, whereas the other community has maintained its language in the home domain, but shifted to the Sindhi language in the market domain. So, so for both these speech communities, the language policy, what's the language policy? This is the top-down policy, can adversely affect language maintenance. In Balochistan, for example, Urdu or English is used as a medium of instruction, which has excluded both the Brahmi and Balochi community, and this is according to Manan 2015, Chana and Panizia 2015. And in Sindh, what has happened, that these communities who have moved to Sindh, they are not given an opportunity to educate their children in their respective languages. So they either go to Sindhi, Urdu, or English medium schools. So, so what happens is one of these two communities has moved to Sindhi even in the home domain, and the other has not in the home domain, but yes, in the market domain. So again, we have to look at, yes, we cannot just generalize and say because they have migrated to another part of Pakistan, therefore they have all moved to the dominant language of that particular region. It depends on whether the community feels that their language is important enough to be preserved and to be used in the home domain. So, in conclusion, let's move away. I've already talked about this. Can you move to the next slide? Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, I have explained to you that communities shift for different reasons. Sometimes they shift because of a top-down policy. Sometimes they maintain, or they even shift because of a bottom-up feeling that their own mother tongue has no utility. So there are many reasons why people shift. One from external reason, one is the community itself. So question we need to ask ourselves is, are the members of minority communities willing to assimilate? Just like the Pakistani community in Kelantan in Malaysia, they were willing to assimilate because they were in Malaysia. They were very small. They were marrying local women. Their children were being brought up as Kelantanese. So now their children can't speak any of the, mainly they couldn't speak Urdu. So they adopted the Kelantanese language as their dominant language. So they saw that as social capital for them. Living in Kelantan, there was no use for the Pakistani language. There was greater use for the Kelantanese language, Kelantanese Malay. And then we must also remember the psychological reasons. Most research looks at the community reasons and the social reasons, but let's not forget the psychological reasons, as in the example of the Sindhi Hindu community that I gave you, and their attitude towards their own language, as in the case of the Sindhi. So in this case, the revitalization program has to bear in mind the previous attitude of the first generation, the fact that the second generation did not know its identity as Sindhis. And so you have to revive that fact that, be proud you are Sindhi. Then how will others know that you are Sindhi? You must speak the Sindhi language, but we don't know the Sindhi language, they say. So you must learn. So mothers were in the revitalization program, mothers were encouraged to learn and mothers were encouraged to speak the language to the children. Now, that's a really uphill task because the mothers had to be encouraged, the parents had to be encouraged to learn the language and then encouraged to use the language. All right. Now, I've also talked to you about government forces, strong forces like the government, apart from the community itself, the medium of instruction, the colonial policy, the brutal language, like the case of the lost children in Australia. And we have lost children not only in Australia, but in Canada, in many countries where the colonial government, when they came, actually wanted to assimilate the Aboriginal children, and many Aboriginal children actually died in boarding schools, as you must have heard about the situation in Canada. So basically, to determine if you are looking at revitalization strategies, how to make a community want to use its language, you have to find out why have they lost their language, and only then can you determine appropriate strategies to revitalize the language. So you have to find out, when did they lose the language? Do they know their language? Why did they move away from their language? Is it due to top-down government policy, or is it a bottom-up response from the community? Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Maya Khemnani David, for such an insightful talk, and taking us through all of your researches, and as we talk about the reasons why people, our communities, speech communities, shift from their mother tongues. So yes, one of the questions I see is from Hassan Abbasi, and he says, how can we promote our revitalized mother tongues in social and religious domains, as they are close dense networks?
In the religious domain, Hassan?
Yes, social and religious domain.
Okay, let's talk about the religious domain, because we did a book on identity in the religious domain. And let me give you an example of the study that we did. We looked at the Punjabi Sikh Gurdwaras in Malaysia. And we actually went to the Gurdwaras whenever there were prayers, when they were reading the Sukhmani Sahib. And so when we listened to them, and we found that many of the big Gurdwaras had screens, and the screens had the writings in the the Punjabi language. The written language is Gurumukhi. So the screen had it in Gurumukhi, and then there was a translation in English. And so we find that the Gurdwaras, the major Gurdwaras that can afford overhead screens and PowerPoints and so on, they all have it in the Punjabi language, written in the Gurumukhi script. Then there is the translation in the English language. So obviously there's an awareness that the community, this Punjabi Sikh community, has shifted away from the Punjabi language, and they are accommodating to the younger generation. Now, when community leaders themselves, like the priests in the Garanti, as they call them, the priests in the Gurdwara, when they accommodate to the larger population by using the language of the larger population, mainly the younger people, then they are in a way encouraging the shift. But if they don't do that, the community will not know the norms and values of the Sikh religion. So we are caught in a situation where the leaders, the priests, and so on are shifting. In the case of the Gurdwaras in Malaysia, they are shifting to the English language by providing translation. But when they speak and they read from the holy book, they would speak in Punjabi. All right, they would read from Gurumukhi, they will speak in Punjabi, but the translation would be in Gurumukhi, the OHP would be in Gurumukhi, then translation in Romanized English. So Hassan, to answer your question, it's quite an uphill task, even though in Malaysia, the Punjabi Association is actually trying to encourage the Punjabi community to speak, to learn Punjabi, to use Punjabi. I have many members of the community who are family members, and I have been to their homes, and the dominant language in the home is with the young children and grandchildren is all English. So if parents are using English and the grandchildren are only hearing English, so, but they know that when they go to the Gurdwara, they have to bow, they have to do the normal. When they meet an older Punjabi man, they need to bow and touch the legs of the older person. So they know the cultural values, but they speak in English with the parents. So how do you revitalize this? The Gurdwaras actually play a big role. Some of the major Gurdwaras, I know of a Gurdwara in Petaling Jaya itself, where I live. They have what they call afternoon school. So after going to the government school in the morning, where you learn Malay and English Malay as the medium of instruction, English as a subject, you come to that school and you learn the Punjabi script. But then a lot of parents give up after a very short while. I actually followed a school where the first day, so many parents brought a lot of their children, but within a short while, the number of children coming to the school actually fell by a large percentage because the parents themselves says, what's the point? What's the point? It has no utility. The community, for the large part, has shifted to English.
I see. That's wonderful. So for next question, I'm unmuting Muhammad Umair Khan. He wants to ask a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. David. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. The question, can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
Thank you. So my question is related to what you just said. So when the community itself does not see the point in having their mother heritage languages revitalized, so what are some of the more convincing arguments that we can give to members of that community? And secondly, in a diverse country or a diverse locality, how can education systems cater to the need to preserve the heritage languages of multiple communities in schools?
Yes, Muhammad Umar Khan, that's a good question because you are asking me, how do you revitalize when the community itself doesn't see any utility in its own language? As I gave you the quote where one of the people actually said, we are global citizens, we are hospitable people, we value the family. So they're looking at cultural values rather than the language itself. And so in a chapter that we have published recently, you should read that chapter. It's in a Routledge open access. And if you're interested, send me an email and I'll send you the link, because the book is out in, they said mid-February it should be out, and the chapter is open access, so anyone can read it. And we look at, in that book, in that chapter, I actually look at what the language activists, mainly in India, are doing to revitalize the language. And one of the things they are doing is actually encouraging mothers to start using the language. So the language activists are meeting up with mothers to talk about the importance of the language. They are also talking to headmasters of schools where the dominant population in certain areas of India are Sindhis. So they're talking to the headmasters, say, why don't you give scholarship to a student who comes to you for an interview and who can speak in Sindhi with you? So they're trying to encourage through financial means or through emotional means, telling mothers it's your duty, and financial means, telling headmasters, give them a scholarship, if they can hold an interview in Sindhi with you, because many of the Sindhis, young Sindhis can't speak Sindhi also. So and then another language activist, what she has done every year for the last X number of years, she has been having competitions for young children to come and recite nursery rhymes on a global link through video and so on. So the parents are involved. The parents have to teach their children the nursery rhymes, and the children will read the rhyme or recite the rhyme, and it will be video recorded, and prizes are given of iPads and so on. Prizes are given to these children. So this language activist called Asha Chand has been doing this for years, and if you go and look at the web for Asha Chand, you will see the many things that she has been doing as a language activist to revitalize the Sindhi language for a community that, in a way, has in a way lost its language. I did a study of the Sindhis in Singapore, Malaysia, and in London, and of the groups that I talked to, many have shifted to English. So it's an uphill task. Now, your second question, can you repeat your second question? Muhammad Umar Khan, can you repeat your second question?
Yeah, sorry, I could not unmute earlier. Yeah, my second question, first of all, thank you for a detailed response. My second question was, how can educational systems, how can schools cater to a diverse body of students in a multilingual community or a multilingual polity? Can there be can multiple languages be taught, or can instruction happen in multiple languages within a school?
Actually, that's a very interesting question too, because what has happened more recently, very recently, social linguists and applied linguists are talking about translanguaging in schools. So they are talking and they're giving examples of in Europe, for example, how in Europe, in certain parts of Europe, the teachers are actually accommodating to the needs of children who come from different languages. And so they are allowing helpers who know the mother tongue of these children to use that language in the classroom. And they themselves, the teachers themselves, are learning a number of languages so they can communicate with children with different languages. But when I was teaching English, and I moved from teaching, being an applied linguistic, to becoming a social linguist. But when I was teaching English, the government policy in Malaysia was very clear. Even in Singapore, it was very clear. You only use the language, the target language, the language you are teaching. You don't bring in other languages. But over the years, there has been a shift to the notion of translanguaging, where they say you have to accommodate to the needs of the children who come from different ethnic backgrounds with different languages. And I'm trying to look for something that came to me. This came to me from my niece in India, where she sent me a newspaper cutting which shows that that in India, they are now talking about, let me just read it to you, minding their language. 86% of teachers in North India want multilingual classrooms. So that's interesting, that where before we only talked about monolingual classrooms, where if you're teaching English, you use only English. Now there is a demand. 86% of teachers in North India want multilingual classrooms, which means they should be free to talk in Hindi or English or Bengali, in the classroom, depending on the needs of the learner.
Wonderful, Dr. Maya. So we've had a question from Madiha. It's Jamila Ghazal, and she says, why people feel ashamed of using mother tongue in public. So
why do people feel ashamed to use their mother tongue?
Yeah, in public.
In public, as I told you, in the example of the Sindhi community, the refugees felt ashamed because they were made fun of, you're a refugee, you have come to our country. So they wanted to assimilate and become part of the larger Indian community. I mean, there are other reasons, like the Pakistani man in Kelantan in Malaysia. He was one lone voice. His whole family was from that Kelantanese Malay community. So he wanted to be part of the larger Malay community. So it's not being ashamed, but it's feeling a greater need to assimilate with the host community. Did I answer her question?
Yep, very well. So Madiha Afzal asks that how community or indigenous languages can be promoted.
Sorry? How
How in how indigenous or community languages can be promoted?
How can indigenous community languages be promoted?
Yep.
In Malaysia, let me give you an example. In Malaysia, and I'm sure you have in Pakistan and in India and in other parts, we have indigenous communities. In Malaysia, we have what we call the Orang Asli community. Asli meaning, just like in Urdu or Hindi, Asli meaning the first people of the country. So the first people of the country, we have a body that is encouraging them to come and be assimilated and learn Malay and so on. And in fact, we had the first professor from the Orang Asli community, and it was like a big thing, that somebody from the Aboriginal community can become a professor. So I think when community members of the Aborigine community see people from their community holding good positions, political positions, educational positions, then they will realize the importance of the other language. Otherwise they are left in the jungles and they are left isolated. So they need to be assimilated to the larger community if they want to have upward mobility. So it depends on what the community wants. Do they want upward mobility? If they want upward mobility, then they have to assimilate with the larger community.
Yeah, so we have similar questions from Fatima Yusuf from Nigeria. She asked that does discarding mother tongue impact positively on students' competence and fluency in the English language classroom? And also, Dr. Zainab from Iraq asks that will such discard make the acquisition of learning of other languages easier?
Sorry, is it on the chat? I couldn't
No, it's
get
not.
you.
No, it's not on the chat. So Dr. Zainab asked that will such discard make the acquisition or learning of the languages easier?
That's the what? The discard.
Yes. Yes. So discarding mother tongues. So will it make acquisition of other languages like English easier?
That is a very good question again, because they say if you have your mother tongue, recent research shows that if you have your mother tongue, it's easier to learn other languages. So, if you have a base language, and if you look at the work by people like Professor Vivian Cook, who passed away recently, you will see that he argues that if you have one language, it helps you to learn other languages more easier. It's easier to learn other languages. And so I think have a look at Vivian Cook's work and what he did. Professor Cook, C-O-O-K. Vivian Cook. Yeah, he was my professor in the University of Essex years ago, but I think he passed away last year. But his books are all available. And see what he says about having a base language which will help you move on to learn other languages. That was one question. There was another question by somebody else.
Yes, kind of similar question that does discarding mother tongues facilitate English language learning in the classrooms?
I think having a base language, my base language, because my grandmother brought me up, was Sindhi. right? And though Sindhi is no longer my dominant language, I think Sindhi helped me. Even in kindergarten, I remember, I must have been 5 years old then. I remember when they had a little test, when they gave you a string and they asked me what was that in English. But I gave them the Sindhi word first. So, and then I gave them the Malay word because I was living in a neighborhood with Malay members, with members who spoke Malay. And so then I gave them English word last. So it seems that in my memory bank, my first language came first. Of course, today, English has become my first and more dominant language. And so over time in anybody's life, language moves from what is your dominant language, what is your mother tongue. Over time with different individuals, it can shift. So when I was teaching a master's program in Malay, I was even dreaming in Malay, although Malay was not the language of my schooling, but it was a language I learned to teach, right? So I'm just giving you personal experience, and my own feeling is if you have your mother tongue as your base, it helps you to move on to other languages.
Mhm. So yeah, so it would be right to say that it's vice versa than they think. So rather, mother tongues and first languages has facilitating role, and when you move to learning other languages, and after you have a strong base in your mother tongue, then it becomes quite easier.
Yeah, I would suggest to read work, Dr. Mansoor, if you can read work of Dr. Vivian Cook, that would be good. It would open your mind to what first language can do for second language acquisition.
Wonderful, Dr. Professor Maya Khemnani David. What a pleasure having you at Teacher Development Webinars, and what an interesting and insightful session it has been. So, any final message for our audience as we celebrate International Mother Language Day webinar series?
Well, International Mother Tongue Day actually says one should use mother tongue. One should use. But what I have been trying to tell you that there are many reasons why communities move away from their mother tongue. And sometimes these are top-down reasons and sometimes they are bottom-up reasons. Top-down meaning pressure from others like political parties, government, education. Bottom-up meaning the community itself decides that their own language doesn't have utility. So in order to revitalize and encourage people to use their mother tongue, perhaps we can actually talk about Dr. Mansoor's idea that and actually focus that if you have a first language, it actually and give evidence from perhaps books like people like Vivian Cook's books, Professor Cook's books, to show how first language helps in the learning of second and third languages. So mother tongue is important.
And thank you so much, Professor Maya Khemnani David, for your wonderful talk. Really appreciate your expertise on this very topic. And thank you very much for all members in the audience, YouTube, and on Zoom session. If you're interested to obtain certificate for this session, you can email on info.tdwebinars@gmail.com. For our future sessions, please sign up at www.tdwebinars.org, and we share the events information on social media channels. We're available on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and our Twitter handle is @tdwebinars. If you are watching this session, please don't forget to share your takeaways and tag us at TD Webinars. The recording of the session will also be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. There's a whole playlist of International Mother Language Day webinar series where you can watch the recordings of Professor Maya Khemnani David and other members, which include, Dr. Ghazala Rahman Rafiq, and will be in having talk from Professor Gilad Zickerman soon. So yeah, thank you very much all. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.